In 2017, Georgia Congressman Tom Price was nominated as Trump's head of Health and Human Services. His resignation to take on his new role triggered a special election between Republican Karen Handel and Democrat Jon Ossoff. The race sparked national attention and was widely reported on as a referendum on Trump. The contest soon became the most expensive House race in history.
Democrat in this race, Jon Ossoff, had brought in $23 million, Republican Karen Handel $4.5 million, but outside groups $25 million.
Ossoff spent over $30 million marketing himself as a sensible moderate in a wealthy and historically Republican district.
He now is running more as a fiscal moderate. He's using a lot of terms you would typically hear Republicans say. I want to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. I've identified billions of dollars of wasteful spending I want to cut. He talks about lowering taxes for small businesses.
This is a Fox News alert. The most expensive House race in history is ending with the Republican winning.
Over the last several years, Democrats have been running ever more moderate candidates against an increasingly reactionary Republican Party, and losing repeatedly. Clinton in 2016, Ossoff in 2017, perhaps others in 2018. And with both Joe Biden and Michael Bloomberg apparently planning to run in the Democratic presidential primary in 2020, the trend will continue. Why this preference for moderate or centrist candidates? There are likely several factors, but the single greatest one is a naive belief in the Part 1, Median Voter Theorem. The Median Voter Theorem is an economic model of voting that claims that in any election between two candidates, like the United States, politicians will inevitably drift towards the views of the middle voter in order to get the most votes. First formally introduced in a 1948 paper by Dr. Duncan Black, the author claimed that this theory, quote, would appear to present the basis for the development of a pure science of politics. The conclusion of the paper is simple. If you want to win a vote, your best bet is to take the middle position. I've linked to some videos that explain this in a little bit more detail, but that's the general idea. Now, Dr. Black does note that certain strong assumptions must hold if this model is to work. I'll talk about those more later. For now, let's move on to the effects of this theory on contemporary political discourse. The 2012 election was the last time both parties apparently expressed a belief in the median voter theorem, when both believed that the key to electoral success was to moderate. Shortly after Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney lost to President Obama, the GOP released an autopsy of the election. Across nearly 100 pages, the report analyzed the causes of the Republican loss and put forward a set of recommendations that would lead the party to victory in the future. One of the top points states, quote, "We have become experts in how to provide ideological reinforcement to like-minded people, but devastatingly we have lost the ability to be persuasive with, or welcoming to, those who do not agree with us on every issue." But the policy changes were most significant. Discussing economic policy, the report states that, quote, "We have to blow the whistle at corporate malfeasance and attack corporate welfare," a talking point associated normally with the economic left. The report also called for the establishment of an inclusion council that would specifically work to appeal to, quote, "Hispanic, Black, Asian, and gay Americans and demonstrate that we care about them too." If it failed to do this, the report warned that the party would risk, quote, "shrinking to its core constituencies only." And as we all know, the GOP wholeheartedly embraced the autopsy's recommendations, and in 2016 nominated a mild-mannered lifelong businessman who warmed up to Hispanics,
I love the Mexican people,
supported the LGBT community,
I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens,
respected women,
I respect women more than I respect men,
and generally came off as a pretty nice guy.
I said, I don't remember.
There was actually a pretty big cannery in the coal mine for all this way back in 2012. I remember watching coverage of the election and hearing lots of Republican primary voters saying they grudgingly voted for Romney only because they thought he was a moderate and respectable enough to win the general election.
I chose between stick in the eye and a needle in the eye, and I went with Mr. Romney.
Clearly, the Republican voter base took away the right lesson from Romney's loss. What about the Democrats? Part 2. What about the Democrats?
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2-3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin.
This line summarizes the entire Democratic approach in 2016. Their entire strategy assumed that by putting forth a sensible centrism, they would win over way more moderate voters than they lost on the margins.
Donald Trump has won the state of Pennsylvania.
What's really key to understand here is just how confident the Clinton campaign was in their blue wall. I mean, they were trying to flip solid red states like Georgia and Arizona by the end of it, only to lose core states they had taken for granted.
CNN now projects that Donald Trump will carry the state of Wisconsin.
It's also important to note that Trump didn't do that well himself. In fact, he won with fewer total votes than Romney had when he conceded in 2012. The difference was that Clinton performed even worse in critical states. In Pennsylvania, for example, she certainly lost those blue-collar Democratic voters in Western PA, but she did not pick up those moderate Republicans in the suburbs.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2-3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We will pick up
2-3
moderate Republicans.
We will pick up 2-3 moderate Republicans.
And this is essentially why the Democrats lost, taking their base for granted while hoping to pick up moderates by moving towards the center. The limitations of the median voter theorem, as originally stated by Dr. Black and further elaborated on by other researchers, can tell us a lot about where it all went wrong. So let's go back to those assumptions that underlie the model that I mentioned earlier. First, for the model to work, we have to assume that voters will vote for the ideologically closest candidates, no matter how far away they are politically. Voters won't become discouraged if you're too alienated from their beliefs. And likewise, you won't energize any new voters just by moving closer to their political positions. In reality, if neither candidate is especially appealing to you, then you'll probably do what nearly half of eligible American voters already do, and just not vote. This is exactly what we saw in 2016. Voter turnout was actually at a 20-year low. That doesn't mean much if non-voters are evenly distributed between the two sides. But we know that they're not. According to the Pew Research Center, non-voters lean young, lean poor, and are more ethnically diverse than voters. And all three are groups associated with more left-wing political views. In fact, non-voters are much more likely to identify as Democrats than as Republicans. While the plurality identify themselves as moderates, a 2012 study found that non-voters would actually have voted for Obama by a significant margin, especially compared to actual voters, and were more supportive of expanding the role of government, raising taxes on the rich, and withdrawing from Afghanistan while being more hostile to repealing Obamacare. All this seems lost on the Democrats. There's a whole world of discouraged voters they could capture. Instead, they are focusing too much on dividing up the existing electoral pie,
moderate Republicans,
when they should instead be interested in growing the size of that pie. Second, a big story in political science over the last several decades has been the decline of party affiliation. Where once most Americans identified with one party or the other, these days the plurality of voters, 44% in August of 2018, identify as political independents. This framing conjures a certain image of American politics: hardline Democrats on one side, hardline Republicans on the other, and a whole lot of undecided independents in the middle, ready to vote for whichever party courts them most effectively. You can't step too far away from the center, even to energize your own base, because doing so means conceding the entire independent bloc to your opponent. Likewise, if your opponent is suddenly a crazy hardliner,
racism,
the best thing you can do is swing to the center and grab all those moderates that are repulsed by the radicalization of your opponent. A second key assumption of the median voter theorem is linearity, the idea that you can line up political ideologies on a simple spectrum. I'm not going to argue here about which political compass is actually the correct one, but I do want to highlight that this linear framing implicitly promotes the idea of a two-sides political theater with a massive independence in the middle, easily deciding between parties based on how far apart they are ideologically. To put it more technically, voters have single peaked preferences. They have one set of policies they like the most, and the further away a proposal is from that, the less they like it. But it turns out that none of that is actually the case. Actually, most independents aren't true centrists or moderates. As one article puts it, quote, "Experts suggest that independents, true independents, who genuinely favor neither major party and hopscotch among Democratic, Republican, or third-party choice depending on the office or election, may constitute as little as 5% of the electorate and are nowhere near the 25% or more that show up in registration numbers or polling." The author continues, quote, "Scratch not too far below the surface and you will find most independent voters are in fact partisans, who routinely vote with one party or the other. They simply prefer not to be affixed with any political label." Let's look at some hard evidence. When pressed, most independents will tell you that they are actually party-leaning independents, which means they typically stick to one party and just avoid the label. Party-leaning independents have very similar views to those outright identifying with the party. A 1995 study found that, quote, "The vast majority of self-defined independents are not neutral but partisan, a bit bashful about admitting it, but partisan nonetheless." Professors of political science Dr. Jana Krupnikov of Stony Brook University and Dr. Samara Klar of the University of Arizona write in Vox that, quote, "What distinguishes independents from partisans is not their political positions. In fact, most independents aren't independent at all. They hold clear partisan preferences, but they utterly refuse to identify with their preferred party." Long story short, independents are not actually up for grabs, as Democrats learned the hard way in 2016.
Donald J. Trump is the President of the United States.
This fact is borne out in the polling numbers. If the electorate truly were made up of a bunch of centrist independents and a smaller crowd of partisans on each side, we would expect centrist proposals to consistently poll as the most popular policies, with popularity dropping off as proposals become more radical. But this is evidently not the case. For example, while Obamacare, which was largely developed out of a Heritage Foundation proposal and was created through a range of left-right compromises, none of which led to any Republicans voting for it, by the way, Medicare for All, which has been denounced by the political right as vile socialism,
under Medicare for All, you actually get to cover...
currently sees about 70% support across the US, including a majority of Republicans. This is true for a range of other left-wing policies, like raising taxes on the rich, greater funding for pre-K programs, and automatic voter registration. That last one actually brings up another important topic that really deserves its own video. Remember how I said that a big problem for the Democrats is a large Democrat-leading population not turning out to vote? That's not just because they're uninspired, but because they're actively suppressed in many cases. Courts have struck down some such attempts, most famously in North Carolina in 2016, when a US Circuit Court found that one law targets, quote, "African Americans with almost surgical precision." But that's another matter entirely. Just keep in mind that making voting easier is also really important. Over-applying the median voter theorem to real politics has been a major flaw in Democratic strategy in recent years. This moderate strategy failed when trying to pass Obamacare, failed in 2016, failed in Georgia, almost failed in Alabama, and I worry that if Biden, or even worse, Bloomberg, win the Democratic primary in 2020 on a moderate platform, we'll just see a replay of 2016. The lessons I want the Democrats to take away are instead: 1. True independents don't really exist. 2. Partisan left-wing policies are often more popular than centrist or compromise proposals. 3. Focus on growing the size of the electoral pie, not stealing votes from the Republicans. I want to leave off with one final statistic. If there's one thing you remember from this video, let it be this: Trump's approval rating among Republicans. Never Trump Republicans may pop up on the media a lot, but most people on the right love Trump. In fact, his popularity among Republicans has actually risen since the beginning of 2018, surpassing 90% in recent polls. Don't try to charm these people by moving towards the center. It didn't work in 2016, and it certainly won't work now that 90% of the right are Trump fanatics. Stop compromising and stand for what we know most Americans believe in.